Hi everybody and welcome to a new episode of Diagnose Dan. Today we're working on this 2011 Volkswagen Golf 6. And the customer complaint on this car is when you select hot air on the heater inside this car, the passenger side is blowing hot air, but the driver's side is blowing cooler air. So let's diagnose this together. Now first of all, let's confirm the customer complaint. The customer is complaining that if he puts the heater on high on both sides, the passenger side is blowing hot air, but the driver's side is blowing cooler air. So let's see. Let's put both sides on high and see what the temperature coming out of the passenger vent is. It is 53 degrees. And on the driver's side, we've got 27 degrees. So customer complaint confirmed. Now first of all, let's read the codes inside the air conditioning system. Let's read codes. And we've got no codes. Now what are we going to do in a situation like this? We've got no codes, but hot air blowing from the passenger side and cooler air blowing from the driver's side. The first thing we're going to do is check the scan data and look for anything out of the ordinary. As I was going through the data pits of this air conditioning system, this heater system, there was one value that was out of the ordinary, and it is the left front vent temperature. It reads 84.7. The right side is reading 50 degrees, while 100 degrees is the boiling point of water. So apparently our left vent is very, very hot. Well, it's not. So let's take a closer look at this sensor. Now let's do a real quick check before we continue. Our passenger side vent temperature is reading 50 degrees centigrade. Now let's see what it is in reality. It's 48 degrees, 49, and it's reading 49. So that's about right. Now, our driver's side vent temperature is reading 84.7. Now that can't be right because that would be very hot. So let's see what it is. It is 24 degrees. So it's much cooler than the passenger side. And that's because the computer is trying to compensate for the very high temperature the sensor is measuring. Now as we saw, the air coming from the passenger side vent was way hotter than the air coming from the driver's side vent. Now inside each vent there's a sensor measuring the air temperature. Now the sensor inside the driver's side vent is reading a value that is way too high, and the computer is actually compensating for this by cooling things down on this side. Now as we want to diagnose this sensor, first we got to learn more about thermistors. Now, if we want to diagnose our temperature sensor, first we've got to learn about thermistors. A thermistor is basically a resistor which resistance changes under the influence of temperature. Now this over here is our temperature sensor or thermistor, and it doesn't matter if it's a coolant temperature sensor or an air temperature sensor, they're all the same. Now this over here is our computer, and inside the computer there's an internal resistor. Now the computer is watching the voltage drop or the difference in voltage across that resistor. The computer is also sending a positive feed into our thermistor. Now as the resistance of our thermistor is very high, there's basically no path to ground. So no current is able to flow through this resistor. So, as there's no path to ground, if there is 5 volts on this side of the resistor, there's also 5 volts on this side of the resistor. So the difference in voltage or voltage drop across the resistor, in this case, is 0. Now, as the temperature changes and the resistance of our thermistor starts lowering, it creates a path to ground. And now, there is a difference in voltage between this side of the internal resistor and this side. This is called a voltage drop. And by watching the voltage drop across the internal resistor, the computer can calculate the temperature. Now I can tell you guys how a thermistor works, but how cool is it if I can show you guys how it works? So I made this little setup, and for an internal resistor, I'm using my test light. And to measure the difference in potential or the voltage drop across our resistor, I'm using a voltmeter. Now, for a thermistor, I am not using a real thermistor, but to simulate a thermistor, I'm using a resistor which I can manually change. Now, in this moment, the resistance of a resistor is so high, there's no path to ground. So, there's 12 volts in front of our resistor, or in front of our test light, and it runs through our test light, and it stops at our resistor. So there's 12 volts over here, but also 12 volts over here. So there's no voltage drop or no difference in potential across our resistor, as we can see on our voltmeter. Now, as temperature changes, the resistance of a thermistor also changes. Now, as I manually lower the resistance, I'm creating a path to ground. And as I'm creating a path to ground, current is able to flow to ground again. Now, there's 12 volts in front of our test light, but there's a ground after our test light. So there's a difference in potential or a voltage drop across our resistor of 12 volts right now. Now, as temperature changes, the resistance of a thermistor also changes. Now I can simulate this by dialing up and dialing down this resistor. And you can see the voltage drop across our internal resistor also changes. And the cool thing is we can actually see the increase and the decrease of the current flow through our test light. Now, by measuring the voltage drop across our internal resistor, the computer can actually use a thermistor to calculate the temperature. Now, what we have learned about our temperature sensor or our thermistor is that it's basically a path to ground for the internal resistor inside the computer. Now, the next thing I want to do is check the wiring coming to the sensor. Now, although I used 12 volts in my example, almost all thermistors are fed by 5 volt, including this one. Now, if we disconnect the connector from our sensor, we should see on one side a 5 volt feed coming from the computer, and the other side should be a ground. So if we measure across those two pins, we should see 5 volts. So let's do that. Let's get the sensor out and let's disconnect the connector. And let's measure across those 2 pins. And be careful not to spread the terminals. And we should see 5 volts. Now let me put on the ignition, and there is our 5 volts. Now what this tells me is the wiring to our sensor is okay, and that the problem probably lies within the sensor itself. I hooked the temperature sensor out of a Golf up to an ohm meter, and what we'll do is watch the resistance of our sensor as I heat up the sensor with this heat gun. Now what we should see is a dramatic change in resistance inside of the sensor. Now, although the heat coming from the heat gun is very hot, we only see little change in the resistance. So let's compare it to a new one. Now I hooked up the new sensor. Let's see how this one responds. Now we see an immediate and significant change in resistance. So let's put it in the car and see if we've got a fix. I changed the temperature sensor, and right now it's reading 29 degrees. So let's check. $30 degrees. So that's close enough. Guys, you've got a fix. Now the customer complaint on this car was that the driver's side vent was not getting as hot as the passenger side vent. Now after replacing the temperature sensor, let's do a final check and compare the driver's side vent temperature to the passenger side temperature. So on this side, 42 degrees. Car is still warming up, by the way. And the passenger side, 42 degrees. So fix confirmed. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and thanks for watching and thanks for learning. Now, if you want to learn more, please subscribe to my channel and you'll get a notification each time I post a new video. And remember, Volkswagen blowing cooler air on one side, check your thermistor. Thanks for watching, and remember, DiagnoseDan Fixed it again.